So hello, my name is Tatiana Farjado, and as Sam has explained now, I'm here today to introduce the author Patrick McGrath. The goal of my talk is to briefly explain both his life and his fiction as they are intertwined. Before I start, I would like to mention McGrath's archive at the University of Stirling in Scotland, where all his material and the research on his fiction can be found. For anybody interested in chatting with me about his work, here on the screen you can see my account on X, and I am also on Blue Sky. So first of all, I would like to explain the order of my talk. I'll begin by commenting on McGrath's childhood at Broadmoor Hospital, which influenced his fiction pretty heavily. I'll move on to analyze his definition of the Gothic, focusing on the concepts of transgression, decay, and madness. After that, I will explain the four main periods in his fiction: the short stories he wrote in the 1980s, then the novels set in the United Kingdom, novels and short stories located in America, and finally, what I call his anti-fascist Gothic. To finish, I will explain the films based on McGrath's novels and a story. So Patrick McGrath was born in London in 1950, and he grew up in Broadmoor Hospital, previously known as Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum in Berkshire, where his father, the psychiatrist Pat McGrath, was employed as the 10th medical superintendent in 1957. In his essay, A Boy Owns Broadmoor, the author claims that his father hated the stigma attached to mental illness and was furious whenever he heard Broadmoor described as a prison, or his patients as criminals, or himself as the warden of a fearsome jail inhabited by howling legions of homicidal maniacs. All this McGrath absorbed, plus some rudimentary knowledge of schizophrenia and psychopathy. So all of this will be clearly useful to understand McGrath's Gothic fiction. In an article on the Daily Mail published in 2012, the writer explains, for example, how a working party of parole patients helped to look after the garden, and these men were his first friends at Broadmoor. He also kindly remembers how his father would narrate the events occurring at work. So names such as Graham Young, the tea poisoner, or Ronnie Cray, the East London gangster and murderer, emerged in their conversations at dinner. On the slide here, you can see on the left Graham Young, a serial killer who murdered at least 3 people by poisoning them, and the Cray twins, gangsters who were well known in the 1950s until their arrest in 1968. Ronnie is the one on the right, and he remained at Broadmoor Hospital from 1999 until his death in 1995. One of the stories that grabbed McGrath's attention when he was a child was the case of a doctor's wife found compromised with a patient by one of the men on a working party. And I quote, "The patient lost all his privileges. What happened to the wayward wife, I don't know. The family moved away soon after." So this is relevant since it serves as the storyline for McGrath's novel Asylum, which I will draw attention to later on. McGrath himself worked in a mental institution in Canada and settled in New York in 1981. Starting first with science fiction, he soon decided that the genre he wanted to focus on was the Gothic, penning scholarly articles on the theme, besides contributing to art magazines with reviews. However, his labeling as a Gothic writer was problematic for some years, since he didn't want to be associated with the genre. Yet the category to him had a clear definition. It should contain transgression and decay. By giving examples such as Bram Stoker's Dracula, Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, McGrath illustrates how the genre breaks down the boundaries of what it is to be human, how it displays the primitive forces of the mind, its ruins, and the political potential these imply. As he analyzed in his chapter for Gothic, Transmutations of Horror in Late 20th Century Art, he considers that there is a before and an after in the figure of Sigmund Freud. He says, before Freud, the Gothic had exclusive access to the workings of the disturbed psyche and a monopoly on the depiction of strange and violent behavior. Freud expanded and systematized this body of knowledge, gave it the name of psychoanalysis, and thus lent it a dignity and prestige it could never have achieved under the rubric of sensational horror fiction. Freud's case studies stand alongside the best of Poe, of Edgar Allan Poe. So McGrath had previously depicted the same conclusion when he co-wrote the introduction to the collection of short stories gathered in the New Gothic, besides Bradford Morrow in 1991. In this collection, we can find writers such as Angela Carter, Anne Rice, John Hawkes, or McGrath and Morrow themselves. Interestingly, both authors highlighted that Gothic fiction in its earliest days was known by the props and settings it employed, by its furniture. Dark forests and dripping cellars, ruined abbeys, riddles with secret passages, clanking chains, skeletons, thunderstorms, and moonlight. To them, this all changed when Edgar Allan Poe introduced a demented mental scene. Here, a more modern Gothic sensibility was born, and I quote, "Now the hell is decidedly on earth, located within the vaults and chambers of our own minds." So Freud is once more mentioned as a relevant figure after Poe. Therefore, it can be indicated that madness for McGrath is another key feature in his Gothic. Remarkably, after this introduction, McGrath will be referred to as a New Gothic writer or Neo-Gothicist by several scholars. McGrath is, as explained, a well-read author in both Gothic fiction and Freudian psychology. Doctors and psychiatrists are a common figure in his writings, and the doctor in McGrath is always Gothic. His interest in artists may stem from his relationships, first with visual artist Orshi Drostic, and later on with the Irish actress Mariah Aitken. His narrators are always unreliable, and medical discourse is placed together with superstitions, which leads to humorous consequences or dramatic effects, depending on the piece of fiction. In his short stories, he focuses more on artists, such as a painter or a writer, to emphasize their obsessions and narcissism. McGrath will return to this in his novel Sport Mungo and Last Days in Cleaver Square, which I will explain later on. Now I am going to elaborate on McGrath's narratives, and I am going to do it chronologically, as his early stories portray characteristics which are more developed in his novels, and this way I also combine them with his biography. The main aspects which can be found in McGrath's short stories are parody and pastiche. Most of his tales appear in Blood and Water and Other Tales, published in 1988, which you can see now on the screen. Two other stories were published in the anthology I Shudder at Your Touch in 1991, and The Smell appeared in the New Gothic, the collection I was mentioning before. As I do not have much time, I will summarize two of the stories in this collection. The Angel, as it depicts characteristics which will be repeated in his later fiction, and Blood Disease, precisely for the opposite reason. It employs vampirism, a rare feature in McGrath's work. So in The Angel, which is set in Manhattan, we can find a writer who meets the elderly Harry Talboys, an extravagant, androgynous neighbor, who narrates to him the story of the dandy Ensign Habershaw, who had an uncanny physical likeness to Harry and whom he knew back in 1925. Ensign is described as an angel who committed sins. And the ending of the story, sorry for the spoiler, develops that Harry in reality is Ensign, and he's a man who cannot die, yet his body is decomposing. So in the paragraph there, you have Harry's flesh had rotted up his lower ribs and belly, and the clotted skin still clinging to the ribs and hip bones that bordered the whole was in a state of gelatinous putrescence. In the hole I caught the faint gleam of his spine, and amid an indistinct bundle of piping, the forms of shadowy organs. Consequently, in the story, you can find how the writer works on body horror, hedonism, and religion. And the second story I chose, Blood Disease, is what, as I say, one of the very few stories that McGrath includes vampirism, even though his characters present vampiric attitudes more commonly. The tale, set in 1934, starts with the anthropologist known as Congo Bill being bitten by a mosquito and exhibiting symptoms of malaria in a rainforest. So he leaves the Congo with a monkey as a present for his son Jack, and is looked after by his wife, Virginia in Berkshire. They stop at an inn named the Blue Bat, and they meet the gentleman Ronald Dexter, a distant relative of Virginia's, who she has an affair with, and Dexter's valet, Clutch. Well, the monkey dies at the inn, and Jack decides to bury it in the cellar with the help of another child, Meg Pander. The narrative unfolds with the revealing of the blue bats being a refuge for anemics, since, and you have there the quote, Kevin Pender had watched his wife sicken and die of the disease. This trauma had brought about what is clinically termed as hyatrophobic reaction in a young innkeeper, a pathological dread of doctors, with the result that when he detected the first symptoms in himself, he did not seek treatment, but instead began to gather about him a cadre of anemics who, like him, were prepared to live and die beyond the pale of contemporary medical practice. The vampirism of those who dwell in the cellar coexists with the malaria of the guest, and both feed upon the English upper classes, who are presented as snobbish and arrogant. So now I will move on to McGrath's early novels, the ones set in England mainly. In 1989, McGrath wrote his first novel, The Grotesque. In this hilarious book, the reader finds paleontologist Sir Hugo Cole confined to a wheelchair, paralyzed and mute, and he is another unreliable narrator. He tells us the events at his estate, Crook, which he rules tyrannically. His daughter's fiancé, Sidney Gilbert, disappears and is allegedly murdered by George Leckie, Hugo's friend from Africa. Cole later states that Sidney's bones were given to their pigs, and at the same time, these pigs were served as sausages, so cannibalism is introduced in the story. Hugo is obsessed with Fletch, his new butler, whom he considers is attempting to replace him as the lord of the household and in his wife's bed. At the same time, Hugo's repressed homosexuality lurks as he's obsessed with Fletch's appearance, describing him sexually. The decline of aristocracy, obsession, and the blurring of reality versus fiction are the main themes in the novel. The following year, McGrath abandons his dark humor to publish Spider. Set in the 1950s in London, Dennis Clegg, nicknamed Spider, arrives in East London near the house he grew up in after spending 20 years at a psychiatric hospital. He commences to write a journal to understand his trauma after the death of his mother and his complicated relationship with his abusive father, Horace, who becomes friendly with a prostitute named Hilda. Now, Spider believes his father murdered his mother and buried her in their garden, and that way the child created the prostitute to avoid seeing his mother as a sexual being. He used to spy as a child on his parents through a crack in their bedroom door. The Freudian Oedipal complex is distorted here since Spider kills his mother, not his father, and the novel painstakingly details schizophrenia. Besides, the atmosphere is oppressive. The foggy London, the murky canals, the smell of gas Spider thinks oozes from his body, all of them echo his mental disorder. The novel focuses mainly on the narrator's flashbacks. In 1993, McGrath continued with another unreliable narrator, on this occasion recapturing the element of an androgynous angel in his novel Dr. Haggard's Disease. McGrath tells the story of an unhealthy love, which becomes an obsession and is compared to a disease, another feature that is prevalent in his fiction, that of comparing love to a disease. During World War II, Edward Haggard, addicted to morphine, works as a country doctor and lives as a recluse. One day he is visited by a Spitfire pilot, James, son of Haggard's ex-lover Fanny. James was meant to be initially named Dorian and have a major role in the storyline as a reference to Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, but McGrath decided to change the plot. As Haggard narrates his affair with Fanny during his medical training and how her husband discovers them, his mental instability develops, and the narrative is basically a monologue. In his acknowledgement in the novel, McGrath mentions his father, Patrick McGrath, as an immense help not only on this book, but on Spider as well. And the last novel, written in the 1990s and set mainly in England, is Asylum. So Peter Cliff is a psychiatrist who runs a mental institution and behaves like a Bluebeard figure, controlling everybody. Echoing the story McGrath had known as a child, in this case Stella Raphael, the wife of forensic psychiatrist Max Raphael, has an affair with the patient and sculptor Edgar Stark. From the very beginning, the relationship is referred to as sexual obsession, and importantly, the plot takes place in 1959, when the Mental Health Act had been passed by law. This act defined mental disorders for the first time and was meant to treat patients, when possible, in community care instead of institutions. Stella runs away with Edgar, yet she returns to her husband mainly for their child, Charlie. Max is fired and must work in a minor hospital in Wales. And Charlie drowns while in Stella's care, and she is treated for her media complex by Peter back in England. So interestingly, these 4 novels were reviewed in 1998 on the platform Psychiatry Online as examples of McGrath's brilliant technique to depict psychiatric illnesses and the care needed for them. The following period reflects McGrath's own living between England and New York. His next 2 novels are a transition from the old to the new world, especially the first one, the one you can see there, Martha Peak, a historical novel where the American Revolution coincides with the inception of the Gothic genre in England. The plot of the novel is complex, but mainly it covers how in the 1820s, William III summons his nephew Ambrose to Drogo Hall, where the anatomist Lord Drogo lived. William tells the tale of Harry Peake and his daughter Martha in London 50 years earlier. Peake had lost his wife and broken his back in a fire, and he made a living as a poet and idealized the American dream. Nevertheless, he became an alcoholic and raped his daughter. She fled to America after the assaults and married the son of a merchant. There, she gave birth to a son with a misshapen back. So, echoing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Lord Drogo, however, is illustrated as a benevolent figure to Harry, whom he experimented upon. McGrath was inspired by the relationship between John Hunter and Charlie Byrne, the Irish giant who was regarded as a freak during his lifetime. On the slide here, you can see an etching of Byrne. There are 3 giants, and the tallest is identified as Charles Byrne, and the others are twins. His skeleton was displayed in London, and it was finally removed in 2023 due to ethical debate. The second novel, Port Mango, has Jean Rathbone as the narrator mostly of her brother's life, the Gauguin-like painter Jack. The siblings live alongside their father while their elder brother Gerald travels and remains apart from them. At 17 years of age, Jack meets Vera, a Scottish painter he falls in love with, and with whom he lives in New York, Cuba, and Port Mango, a fictional town in Honduras. Their elder daughter Peg dies in a mangrove, and her death haunts the family. Years later, Anna, the younger daughter, who had lived with Gerald as she grew up, appears in New York to learn what happened to her sister. McGrath again reworks the trope of incest and unreliable narration, having a painter who behaves like a psychic vampire with his narcissism and draining the life source of those around him. And Anna is compared to a ghost who brings up the past. Jack's art emphasizes his self-centered existence with paintings like Narcissus in the Jungle. So after these two novels, the writer published a collection of 3 stories and 2 novels set in America. Ghost Town, Tales of Manhattan, the Manhattan Then and Now, Trauma, and Constance. So Ghost Town was written in response to an invitation from the publishing house Bloomsbury, and there are 3 stories set in different centuries in Manhattan. First, we can find the Year of the Gibbet, where a son is haunted by his mother's death during the American Revolution, after she confronts an English commander and she's incriminated of treason. The second story, Julius, moves on to mid-19th century, where again the author combines madness, transgression, and decay. Here, a female descendant of one of the main characters of an upper-class family narrates how the young Julius is mistreated by his father and develops an interest in art, specifically landscape painting, similarly to Thomas Cole and the Hudson River School. He falls in love with an Irish model, and his father makes the girl disappear due to her origins and social condition. Julius loses his mind and is treated for 20 years in the Catskills, echoing the life of real painter Rolf Albert Blakelock, who spent most of his lifetime in mental institutions. You can see him there on the slide. The last story, Ground Zero, takes place after the attack to the Twin Towers and has a psychiatrist obsessed with a patient of hers, Danny Silver. Danny starts a relationship with the Chinese prostitute Kim Lee, who believes can see the ghost of her boyfriend dead during the terrorist attacks. All these stories emphasize not only the ghost as a haunting past, but also the mother figure the nation represents. In Trauma, set in New York in the 1980s, the protagonist is Charlie Bayer, a psychiatrist as troubled as the Vietnam veteran he treats. Specialized in post-traumatic stress disorder, Charlie transforms from doctor to a patient himself to deal with a violent trauma he suffered during his childhood. Divorced from Agnes, mainly because he talked with her brother, a veteran, about his experiences in the war before he committed suicide, Charlie attempts to begin a new relationship with a woman named Nora, but it does not work. Now, this novel is read more as a thriller than as a Gothic text, and while in other narratives we do not know where the trauma originates from, at the end of this novel, the reader learns from the doctor's incident as a child. And the last of the novels set in America is Constance, a story with 2 narrators. The title character, Constance Schuyler, an editor in New York, and her husband, Sidney Klein, an academic specialized in romantic literature and 20 years her senior. Their travel marriage takes place in the 1960s, and the text has the air of an old motion picture. Constance escapes from Ravenswood in the countryside where her domineering father Morgan lives. Their mother died when they were young. Constance has a sister, Iris, working as a hostess in a hotel. It is later known that Morgan, suffering from dementia, is not Constance's father, and this triggers a turmoil in her. She commences to call Sidney Taddy and seeks a father figure in him, and at the same time she starts hearing voices. McGrath does not renounce to his Freudian approach in this text either. So some years later, in 2017, the writer begins what I call his anti-fascist Gothic. Worried about Donald Trump's politics in the USA, McGrath's 2 latest novels are more political and exposed to infamous figures, Oswald Mosley and Francisco Franco. In The Wardrobe Mistress, the writer introduces the theatrical world of London in 1947. The Jewish wardrobe mistress of the title, Joan, mourns her recently dead husband Gracie, who was a famous actor. The narrative shifts from the loss of a beloved husband to the learning of Gracie's fascist involvement in Oswald's circle. The novel echoes the activities of the Regal 43 group in their fight against fascism. In supernatural terms, McGrath includes the Dybbuk, a malevolent possessing spirit in Jewish mythology, which is believed to be the disconnected soul of a deceased person. So Joan believes her new lover, the actor Frank Stone, is dominated by this Dybbuk of her late spouse, and he is merely a vessel. Therefore, their personalities are constantly blurred. In the archive of the University of Stirling, a script for a film adaptation co-written between McGrath and his wife, Mariah Aitken, can be found. And the latest novel published by McGrath is Last Days in Cleaver Square. McGrath started living in Spain, and his interest in Spanish history, culture, and language is present in this story. Here we find another unreliable narrator, in this case the poet Francis McNulty, a veteran at the Spanish Civil War. He's hallucinating that Franco is visiting him at his London house while the dictator is dying in Madrid in 1975. The apparition literally stinks at his house and is referred to as a ghoul, a demon-like humanoid from Arabic folklore related to the consumption of human flesh, after Antoine Galland's translation of the 1001 Nights into French. There is a significant doubling between Francis and Franco, and there is a third Francisco present in the story, the painter Francisco Goya. His paintings, Caprichos, and the black paintings help illustrate the horrors of the war and the traumas they induce. Consequently, it can be stated that McGrath's fiction is mainly about trauma, madness, and unreliable narrators the reader must guess whether they believe or not. The limited volume Writing Madness collects most of his short fiction and non-fiction, including introductions and book reviews. Now, McGrath has also worked as a screenwriter. In the 1990s, he authored the episode Dream of the Wolf and co-wrote Taking Back the Night with Gail Blaze for The Hidden Room, a television series which aired from 1991 to 1993 and where drama and horror were combined. Some of the writer's texts have been adapted to film, as you can see on the screen. Apart from The Hidden Room, which you can see on your left, McGrath has participated in writing the screenplay of some of his own novels. The Grotesque, also known as Grave Indiscretion or Gentlemen Don't Eat Poets, is a film from 1995 and directed by John Paul Davidson. It has Alan Bates playing Sir Hugo Cole, Teresa Russell as his wife, and Sting as the butler Fletch. Bates and Russell received good reviews for their performances. Some years later, in 2002, perhaps the most known of McGrath's adaptations was released, David Cronenberg's Spider. So before I comment on the differences between the novel and the film, let's see the trailer to get an idea. So the main difference which can be found between both pieces of fiction is that in the novel, the reader follows Spider's journal, his thoughts, which are articulate, whereas in the film, Ralph Fiennes portrays a character who expresses himself via body language more than words. Initially, McGrath decided to add Spider's voice as narrator for his brain work in the film, but Cronenberg discarded the idea. Interestingly, Miranda Richardson plays three roles: Spider's mother, the prostitute, and Mrs. Wilkinson, the landlady where Spider lives. Cronenberg also chose to depict Spider like an artist, creating his own universe, while in the novel McGrath separates from this concept. In 2005, David Mackenzie directed the adaptation of Asylum. Stephen King wrote a screenplay for the film, But finally, Patrick Marber and Chrysanthi Bellis's text was employed. The late Natasha Richardson played Stella Raphael, and Ian McKellen took the role of Peter Cleave. The film, despite of winning an award at the Berlin International Film Festival, was received with mixed reviews. Finally, in 2010, McGrath's short story The Lost Explorer was released, first published in Blood and Water and Other Stories in 1988. The tale is about a 12-year-old girl, Evelyn, who finds an explorer in a tent with a map of the Congo. He's totally delirious with fever in her garden, believing some pygmies are chasing them to eat them. The man imagines Evelyn is Agatha, a nanny who had nursed him as a child. Evelyn discovers that the explorer carries a gun and becomes fascinated by it. And later on, the man moves on from her garden to her bed, insisting that the pygmies are after them. The next morning, Evelyn finds the explorer dead and buries him in her garden. Evelyn continues to see him in her imagination until she turns 14 and a half, when she decides she wants to be a doctor. McGrath shows that colonial Gothic, with its haunting past, is a recurrent topic in his writing. The photographer Tim Walker directed a 20-minute film retelling the events. A volume including the original story and a facsimile of the script with annotations was released in 2011. So to sum up with this talk, I have explained the main themes and tropes McGrath uses in his fiction, and I have chronologically explained his publications. As seen, transgression, decay, and madness are prevalent in all these narratives, and the unreliable narrators stand out as one of the features of his so-called New Gothic. So to finish, here you can see a couple of slides with the bibliography I have used for this talk. And thank you very much for listening to me.